Okay, I'm delighted that we have today with us Stuart Davies, who's Head of Technical Compliance at Viridor. Stuart has helped to put together a session on biogenic carbon measurements, which with COP26 around the corner could not be less topical. With multiple countries and organisations committing to net zero, there must be a massive demand for biogenic carbon monitoring. So I thought it would be useful, Stuart, if we could kick off by, if you could briefly define biogenic carbon emissions and explain why they're important before talking about the presentations at the AQE conference.
Absolutely. So biogenic carbon are the emissions related to the natural carbon cycle, as well as those resulting from the combustion, harvesting, decomposition and processing of biologically based materials. So as distinct to fossil-based carbon, okay, which are those derived from fossil fuels.
Right. So that differentiation is presumably important for anybody that needs to get a handle on their carbon emissions, because if they don't do that differentiation, then they're not going to be able to get a proper handle on their emissions.
Yeah, it's essential in understanding your contribution to emissions to understand whether or not, or what proportion of your emissions are biogenic and what proportion of your emissions are fossil related.
Right.
It's particularly important for sectors which have contributions from both.
Right. So will the presentations at the conference be talking about how you can do this differentiation? And also, I wondered whether there are regulations that are driving people to do that, or is it just that if people want to get a handle on their carbon emissions, this is what they need to do?
So this is a very contemporary issue, and speakers will address the policy framework for the capture and storage of carbon emissions. Process operators will discuss an intended journey to achieve net zero, which is relevant to their industry, and this is an industry which has mixed biogenic and fossil emissions. And presenters will also describe the methods available for the measurement and quantification of biogenic and fossil carbon dioxide in stack emissions.
Okay, sounds good. So how would you define the type of people that should attend this session?
So this session is aimed very squarely at anyone who has an interest in the net zero agenda and how society is going to achieve net zero, in particular, those who currently are active in sectors which have emissions to atmosphere of biogenic carbon and fossil emissions, and how they can manage that transition,
yeah,
and evidence that transition to meet the requirements of future regulation.
Right. And I believe the session is taking place in the morning of the second day, which I think is the 14th of October. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that once people are pre-registered, they will be able or be provided with the details of other people who have registered. So there's a great opportunity there for networking. I mean, not only can people dip in and dip out of a lot of the conference sessions that are going on, depending on what they're interested in, but they'll also be able to network with people who are facing similar issues to themselves, so they can request meetings. But this with it being virtual this year, it will impose an extra responsibility on those who are managing the sessions, because they're dipping in and dipping out, when they dip in, they've got to be confident that that session is still running and it's not the one before overrunning. So that'll be something to watch out for. But
ultimately, this session is a taster session looking ahead to AQE 2022, where following COP26, these issues will be discussed in greater detail, and it's such a rapidly evolving area of emissions management, net zero, and monitoring, that it's going to be a very, very exciting journey for the sector over the next 5 years.
Yeah. And without going into too much detail, is it very complicated or difficult to differentiate between the two different types of emissions, carbon emissions?
It's more difficult monitoring than the monitoring that we would normally undertake as stack emissions. So the differences between biogenic and fossil CO2, there are only a limited number of mechanisms available to make those measurements at this time. So a lot of those are related to, for example, carbon-14 measurement. There are some interesting software tools available which look at the composition of the feedstock material and the quantities of oxygen required to burn it. Those materials.
So is it acceptable or possible to define your emissions if you know what your sources are? Can you kind of extrapolate as to what proportion of your emissions will be of biogenic origin?
Many sectors are able to assess their emissions on the basis of the nature of the feedstock. So if you have a single source or well-characterized feedstock, then such as coal or natural gas, then you'd be able to do that. If you operate in a sector where your fuel is much more heterogeneous, for example, municipal solid waste or co-combustion of wood biomass with fossil fuels, then there's a requirement ultimately to be able to determine the proportions of each in the emission.
Okay.
Additional monitoring. Yeah.
I don't want to go too deeply in it because I'm sure this will all be discussed at length in the sessions. But thanks very much for your time today, and thanks so much for helping to put this session together. It looks like it's going to be really fascinating, and I look forward to watching it.
Thank you. I think it'll be a really exciting taster session for big things to come.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Stuart.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Cheers.